Hey guys, Jason Sensational here. Today I have a little bit of a different video for you guys. It's another one of the videos where I just go on a little bit of a talk about a subject that I had in mind. And this is one that I've always was thinking about in the back of my head that I thought would make for kind of an interesting discussion. That is no other than the region of Ionia, kind of where it's been. Is it strong? Is it weak? Do people like it? There are a lot of things that go into how to evaluate a region, and I have a few cool discussion points that I do want to bring up. If you guys like these kinds of videos, I do hope that you leave a like or comment below, just letting me know how the video went. But without further ado, let's just kind of jump right into it. Ionia, Ionia, Ionia. Who can forget these iconic champions? You guys know them as no other than Irelia, Lulu, Zed, Yasuo, Shen, Lee Sin, and Karma. I'm not going to go into too much details about what these champions do, their role, their lore, whatever within Ionia. That's not really the purpose of this video, but I think that one of the interesting things that I'll definitely allude to later on is just the uniqueness of these champions. Not just from like a lore perspective or even Ionia as a whole, this bunch of like uh, different kind of misfits, different people from completely different backgrounds. Yasuo from like some school of like wind techniques, Shen being the keeper of balance, Zed kind of being the antagonist to that story, but not really, and you know all these like yordles or whatever. I'm not big into the lore that much, but just the uniqueness and diversity that Ionia kind of brings into the region itself makes it for one of the most interesting regions, I would say, and definitely in my opinion it's one of my favorites. Just the mixture of different sorts of mechanics within it, each champion trying to introduce somewhat of their own type of thing, and that kind of reflects like the lore of the champions that they're also in. I do leave this off pretty positive by saying just how unique this kind of region is, but this kind of alludes into a little bit more of the issues within Ionia that I'll probably discuss in a later bit. Let's just start by kind of looking at the region card pool as a whole and just taking sort of a raw power level look at some of the cards. I think that when you think of Ionia, the first thing that kind of jumps into mind is Notify and Deny. These two cards have historically been the most popular two cards that have been put in any Ionia deck. And this doesn't even have to include Ionia decks itself. This could be a deck like an Allegiance deck that simply just splashes cards like Deny as just a really powerful card. For example, back in the day, you had like the Fearsome Misrates Harrowing decks that put in Deny to counter the mirror matchup, for example, or to counter like runations, board wipes, things like that. Ionia has typically been known for having, or pretty much the only region with cards that can actually interact and deny your opponent's spells in ways that cards like, Single Combat or like Glimpse Beyond don't necessarily fulfill. Now, of course, Shrima has gotten Right of Negation as a deny, and that's been like another region so far that has been shifting in that direction in adding this kind of mechanic into their region pool. But historically, these are the two cards that come into mind when thinking about what kind of stands out as a Ionia card. Now, historically in the past, I've also seen a lot of cards or a lot of decks dive into using cards like Concussive Palm and Will of Ionia or other just really powerful spell cards, using them as either like splash cards in an Allegiance deck or just kind of tossing them in based on the meta that just make them really powerful. For example, in the first seasonals, with a lot of Feel the Rush in the meta, splashing Ionia was a really good choice because you had access to the Deny against their Field Rush, you get like Concussive Palm, or you can even play like Will of Ionia to just recall a big Tryndamere, for example. So historically, a lot of these really powerful spell cards have been used by a wide variety of decks throughout the metas. Now, on a card pool level itself, there stands out to be some pretty unique things. There are definitely some really good cards, some really bad cards, and then some really bad cards. Now, you guys will definitely know Eye of the Dragon, even though Eye of the Dragon doesn't see much play outside of 2, maybe 3 main decks. This has kind of been a staple in a lot of Ionia decks, just being able to just create a lot of stall, a lot of heal with the Dragonlings. But beyond Eye of the Dragon, a lot of the other units within Ionia just really fall off on power level. You start diving into some of the weirder archetypes that some of the game developers have tried to push within Ionia, such as like the hand buffs from Greenglade Elder, or like some weird elusive cards like Silent Shadowseer, for example. And these cards just historically have never really seen much play. Never really seen much experimentation either, for that matter, and just kind of fit into their own little separate category of cards that really don't do too much, similar to some of the different champions that we could go into. And just from a raw power level point, in a complete vacuum, Ionia has some pretty good, okay champions, right? Aurelia recently has seen a lot of play in their new decks. Shen and Lee Sin historically have just been some pretty good champions after their recent buffs. And before you guys just get out of your seats and say, well, these champions have been in some really broken decks, and that is true, and that's going to be the topic of the next portion of this video. But just in a vacuum, in purely Ionia, for example, these champions are just okay. They don't really have too much synergy within Ionia itself, and it's only when you start pulling these champions outside of Ionia they find some really powerful synergy. And this is probably what you guys are most familiar with. These are 4 incredibly powerful Ionia decks that have dominated the meta, dominated the ladder, dominated the tournament scene, and have kind of been called out by players as being not very fun to play against, just exerting a higher than normal power level, and just having these really annoying interaction cards, because they're obviously in Ionia, they gotta play Nope, Find, Deny, and combined just with the power level and synergistics values with other regions, these can kind of go out of hand. I think most prevalent in everyone's mind right now is Aurelia Azir, just pairing the Aurelia Blade Dance cards with the Azir Sand Soldier Deus cards, like the buff cards, the recall cards, just being able to swarm turn after turn, attacking even on your opponent's turn, and playing a 2-mana Blade Dance card to summon 14 damage worth of power on board, has just been very predominantly strong in today's meta. Other good examples of these Ionia champions being pulled out of the regions is Shen Fiora Shen, for example, or Zoe Lee, or Ezreal Karma. Shen taking advantage of the fact that barrier units get challenger units get the barrier on their attack in order to just provide a lot of reactivity for, the Shen Fiora player. Lee Sin getting the Overwhelm from Zenith Blade, getting the gems, getting all the cycle cards from Targon like Pale Cascade or Guiding Touch, just making Lee Sin an absolute powerhouse that generates its own value turn after turn. Is able to cycle through its deck and does what the combo deck wants to do, while also having the gem cards that do 2 things for Lee Sin, buffing Lee Sin's attack level, as well as providing a way for it to turbo level really quickly. That historically has made Lee Sin one of the strongest tournament decks in RuneTerra. And of course, who can forget Ezreal Karma? Karma as itself is okay, right? It's just a late game value engine that just aims to outgrind a lot of other decks, but historically has never really seen a good win condition of its own, just being on end games on the spot. And that's where Ezreal Karma kind of came in, just being able to burst down your opponent from 20 health, or even casting Rummage when Karma's leveled up in order to have just a 1-mana draw 4 that just instantly refills your hand and just keeps you on going. Just a bit pretty much summarize here, these Ionia champions on their own are mediocre, to say the least. But because there is so much high synergistic value in a lot of other regions, it makes it very hard to evaluate kind of where these champions really fall under. Without Demacia, for example, Shen just hasn't seen play in pretty much any other region beyond that. Lee Sin has primarily seen play in only Targon. Same with Karma after Ezreal got nerfed. You see Zoe Karma, Karma Lee, just these late game Targon Karma value decks. That, they require on the other regions to really support them up to have these broken mechanics. not broken in to say the least, but like just really synergistic, right? 1+1 = 3. Where the power level just spikes because they have just these synergistic cards within them. And that kind of what leaves me off with the main message here is that Ionia really has a lack of an in-region cohesion. It relies so heavily on the fact that other regions really prop up what some of these Ionia champions want to do, that looking inward onto Ionia, it's very split, it's very scattered, and doesn't really have much going on for one way or the other. And I think a good comparison for that is looking at a region like Noxus, where there's some very, very clear-cut cards that you would either want to put into like a control deck or an aggro burn deck, for example, or having cards that are just multi-purposeful and can kind of fit into different slots. So of course you have cards like Flock that are really good control or mid-range cards. On the aggro burn side, you have like Grenadier, you have the Saboteur, you have Decimate or Fervor for that matter. Or even, you can splash Fervor as like a card in a Swain deck where you play with 3 mana, just halfway level up your Swain. Ionia, on the other hand, because of its diversity, because of its uniqueness that each champion kind of brings to the table, Ionia's pretty much split between pushing too many different archetypes at the same time. Obviously, when they release a new Ionian champion, they have to release the cards to support the champion within the region as well, because otherwise that doesn't really make sense, and it's not, obviously doesn't fit the flavor profile. But what kind of comes out of this is that Ionia as a whole has no power level suited for a particular champion, and that's why they kind of have to go out of region to look at other things. So for example, historically you've had elusives as kind of an archetype that's been dabbled with, played with, sometimes it's been strong, but recently hit with a lot of nerfs, so it's kind of been out of the table. Of course, with Yasuo, you have like the stun recall cards that sometimes you feel like some cards are like really meant for Yasuo decks, and then some other recall cards are just weaker in value, but really don't have much place outside of decks that specifically want to use a recall. And you have barrier cards like Key Guardian. Actually, I can't really think of much more. Shen, Key Guardian, like the Spirit's Refuge. But again, you have no payoff for these barrier cards. You don't really have good units you want to put them onto, and that's of course when you have to go into other things. And of course, support, the historical problem with Lulu and why Lulu has never really seen the play that a champion wants to see. And what's even worse is that these archetypes don't really do much for each other. Like, you don't want barriers in an elusive deck, you don't want stun recall cards in a support archetype, for example. And this just makes it really hard to evaluate certain power levels of certain cards and the power level of region itself when everything is like kind of scattered, being pulled into different directions. Now, you could just kind of make some of the cards better, just like buffing certain archetypes, like, just make stuns in Ionia a lot stronger. But this is kind of where you go back to the problem where we've seen a lot of like the menacing decks, like, Zoe Lee, for example, Ezreal Karma, things like that. Whereas if you just push out cards that just really synergize well with their champions, they become a lot more abusable as well, because now you're not really sacrificing anything because these cards are meant for these particular champions, and then you can just slot them into different cards, right? So if you're playing like Ezreal Karma deck and suddenly you get more direct damage in Ionia, which typically has never happened before, that just makes that deck propped up even better, doesn't make the deck any weaker, and Ionia as a whole doesn't really get that much better, which makes it really difficult to evaluate these things. And of course, this puts Ionia in kind of a gray zone where players have felt frustrated playing against some of these Ionia decks like Zoe Lee because of their power level, because of how strong they really are. But on the flip side, Ionia itself is a relatively weak region. A lot of player opinions on how they feel about Ionia has been relatively like middle ground. Not really strong, but not like the weakest region either, for that matter. But when people are calling out for if they want nerfs, if they want buffs, there's conflict on both sides, right? Aurelia Azir right now is a super powerful deck. It feels a little bit frustrating to play around, and people are looking at Aurelia to kind of get nerfed. In which I don't really think is the issue here, because if you nerf Aurelia, that still doesn't like solve the issue that Aurelia synergizes super well with Azir and his Sand Soldiers. And now if you nerf Azir for that matter, because now we're fixing the problem, right? This deck is a lot weaker, but now Aurelia just doesn't see any play. It's not a card like Draven, where Draven has like 3 different archetypes or decks that it wants to play in, and even if you nerf kind of those archetypes, those decks, Draven is still a very solid champion. And so when people are calling out on, there's gonna be 2 sides of the coin, right? One side wants the buffs, one side wants the nerfs, and it's really hard to say how you want to push that out. I'm no game developer or designer for that matter, so this is definitely not my area of expertise. But having that conflict between these champions doing really well outside the region, but the region itself, beyond its champions and a few certain splash cards, being really weak. So, is there a solution? Good question. I'm glad you asked, because I am definitely not the person to talk to about it. I think that one particular option itself is kind of just having like a region overhaul, rework of maybe like champions, maybe the region try to make it a little bit more cohesive within itself. Obviously that's not very thematic with the lore of the champions, kind of how they fit together. They don't really want to be doing the same things, and that kind of takes away from the diversity. And I would say one of the most interesting parts about Ionia, because I really love Ionia as a region, I just think that it's just always in such an awkward spot. And this is obviously the direction that Riot doesn't really want to do. Reworking champions and even just a region as a whole doesn't really make much sense from like a designer standpoint. I think the second thing that I think that I can't say for sure, but I've heard from somewhere, someplace, Ionia 2 as a region. Ionia is so broad, there's so many champions that come with it, that there's so much content that you can probably make a second region all on it. And if you want, and this might help to group some of the more similar champions in one place and the ones in the other, to, you know, if you want one part of Ionia, you can take it from here. If you want one part of the other, you can take from there, and make the in-region cohesion a little bit better. Like if you want to put elusives and support in Ionia 1, and then you put stun, recall, barriers in Ionia 2, this makes the distinct barriers and boundaries a little bit clearer between decks and archetypes, and which region wants to push them. Or you have this insane synergy between Ionia 1 and Ionia 2 that I think would be really cool, because if you have 2 insanely diverse regions together and somehow they have synergy within each other, I think that'd be a really cool design as well. But again, what do I know, right? I'm just a player. I play Ionia and I like Ionia, but that's kind of where I'll leave things off. I'd love to hear some of your guys' thoughts or opinions on anything I've said here. If you agree, disagree, if you like anything I said, if anything resonated with you, feel free to leave that in the comments below, and we can start a little bit of discussion there. With that being said, I thank you guys for sticking around to the end of the video. If you guys enjoyed just hearing me talk about things like this, I'd be happy to do more of these. If you have any ideas or what you'd like to hear me talk about, feel free to drop that down below as well. And again, please, if you like this video, please leave a like and subscribe. I'm trying my best to push out 2 videos a week, and your support really means a lot to me. So without further ado, I'll leave it there, and I wish you all a very pleasant day.